The day began like any other for Thomas Brown, a young man with short, russet hair and serious yet always kind eyes. He always sought to find something interesting to pass the time. On this day, like many others, he decided to spend it outside of town, heading towards an abandoned landfill he had heard about from friends. Thomas wasn't particularly prone to adventures, but something in his soul urged him to visit this place. Routine always dominated the city, and he thirsted for something out of the ordinary. He greeted the dawning morning with determination and curiosity, which only grew stronger when he recalled the stories about the forgotten landfill. As he walked along a narrow road, the tree branches cast peculiar shadows on the ground, like mysterious symbols. Soon, he saw gates ahead, enclosing the path to the landfill. They looked like the dying remnants of time, decayed and covered in rust. Beyond them lay the abandonment of the landfill, like a door to another world. Thomas sighed and took the final steps. Upon opening the gates, he entered the landfill, where walls of trash and waste rose above him like dark towers. The winds of the landfill swept through the place, and dust hung in the air, creating an atmosphere of mystery and oblivion. Thomas sensed the damp, decaying odor, so thick that it was almost palpable. Deep within the landfill, he noticed a glimmer. It prompted him to move forward, as if an invisible magnet was pulling him. He navigated through heaps of garbage, clambered over debris, until he finally discovered his phantom find, a worn, tattered doll with a distorted face. In that moment, he felt that something had hooked him from within. He sensed that this doll was unusual, as if it held some ancient history within it. Its appearance seemed repulsive and off-putting, but something compelled Thomas to stay and continue examining it. Thomas couldn't explain why he had ended up here, on this landfill, amidst old cast-offs and dust. But there was something about this place, about this doll, that piqued his curiosity and drew him into exploration. Thus began his encounter with the enigmatic Berenson Doll, which brought something unfathomable into his life. Amidst all this desolation, Thomas noticed a flickering corner. He approached it, and his gaze fell upon a torn doll abandoned among the debris. It looked incredibly eerie, covered in dirt and dust, with worn patches on its body and disgustingly distorted facial features. It seemed to hold within it a long tale of a sinister past. Thomas brought the Berenson Doll home, barely holding it in his hands. He carefully placed it on the table and began to examine it more closely. Soon, it became clear to him that this doll was far from ordinary. Its appearance was so strange and distorted that it seemed to embody something deeper and darker. He sat down at the table and began to inspect the doll under the soft light of the lamp. Its worn skin looked like an ancient cloak, weathered through the ages. It seemed to bear the marks of battles and conflicts, like a living witness to time. However, the most horrifying aspect of this doll was its face. The doll's eyes were particularly horrifying. They appeared as inner sparks, glowing in the darkness. The eye color shifted from red to orange, as if an unknown energy lived within them. This gaze made Thomas feel like the doll was watching him, tracking his every move, as if trying to penetrate his soul. The doll's smile, which initially seemed harmless, serene even, began to distort. Every time Thomas looked at it, it grew whiter and more contorted, as if it was trying to convey some horrifying secret. The lips of this smile seemed to be tearing apart, revealing something sinister beneath them. Looking at this doll, it felt as though it was trying to tell you something that you couldn't understand. Its eyes seemed capable of seeing through you, as if they were looking into the deepest corners of your soul. And at that moment, Thomas realized that this doll was not just a lifeless toy, but something more dreadful, more powerful. While he examined every detail of the doll, he felt that something was changing in his surroundings. The air became filled with tension, as if something sinister had begun to loom around him. It was as if the beginning of a nightmare that he could not reject. As the hours turned into days, Thomas became increasingly consumed by his study of the doll. He spent hours examining every detail, as if trying to decipher its hidden secrets. He felt an unusual attraction, as if the doll was luring him into its mysterious world. Days passed, and Thomas continued to study the Berenson doll. He spent hours scrutinizing every detail of its worn skin, delving into the hypnotic gaze of its eyes, and trying to understand what it might signify. The longer he studied it, the more it drew him in, as if an invisible magnet were at work. With each passing day, he noticed that the doll's appearance became less consistent. The eyes, which initially seemed lifeless and dull, began to change their shade. They started to glow with an inner fire, as if they held some mystical energy within them. It seemed as if the doll's eyes contained a soul that was attempting to penetrate his own. He stared at the doll's eyes for a long time, feeling them penetrate deeper and deeper into his consciousness. Every time he blinked, it was as if he saw a trace of their gleam behind closed eyelids. These eyes seemed to induce a hypnotic trance, blurring the boundaries between reality and nightmare. The doll's smile also changed. Initially, it was just slightly curved, like the innocent smile of a carefree child. But as Thomas continued to study it, the smile began to widen, as if its distorted lips were reaching out toward him. It took on new contortions, creating the appearance of a sinister laugh. Thomas experienced something strange, as if he were simultaneously a captive of art and a victim of a mystical attachment. He couldn't tear himself away from the doll, as if it held his gaze, compelling him to explore it more deeply. Every time he returned to it, he noticed new details, new changes in its appearance. The Berenson doll became like a reflection of his own fears and dark thoughts. He felt that it was unlocking some lock within his soul, releasing the emotions and feelings he had tried to hide from everyone. It seemed to bring his deepest fears to the surface, forcing him to confront them. With each passing day, Thomas felt that something inside him was changing. He began to notice that his sleep became restless, and nightmares began to infiltrate his consciousness. He dreamed of the Berenson doll coming to life and hunting him, as if it were trying to draw him into its world of nightmares and fear. Thomas felt that he was gradually losing control over himself, as if the Berenson doll was gaining the upper hand. He started to feel that this doll was increasingly influencing his thoughts and emotions, as if it had begun to take control of his mind. Something unknown and mystical began to penetrate his life, making him wonder what was truly inside this doll and what secrets it held. Nights became hazy and restless, as if the boundaries between reality and nightmare were starting to dissolve. Thomas would go to sleep with a sense of dread, knowing that his nightmares would once again embrace him. He entered the world of dreams with an apprehensive feeling, as if approaching the edge of an abyss of madness. His nightmares began with him standing in a landfill, surrounded by towering heaps of garbage that rose like impending horrors. The Berenson doll stood atop one of these mounds, its eyes blazing with fire, and its smile growing increasingly distorted. With each step Thomas took through this nightmarish dump, the garbage came to life. The waste transformed into grotesque and loathsome creatures, pursuing him with their rotten limbs, emitting eerie sounds. He ran, trying to escape this nightmarish reality, but the Berenson doll was always there, blocking his path. In one of the nightmares, he found himself inside the doll's body. He saw the world through the eyes of this dreadful figure, feeling its sinister control over events. He watched himself from an outsider's perspective, as he futilely attempted to escape from this nightmarish reality that was engulfing his sanity. Every night became more horrifying, and each nightmare plunged him deeper into the abyss of madness. He couldn't comprehend what was happening, and when he woke up, his breath was choked with fear. His reality began to disintegrate, and the nightmares infiltrated his waking life, causing him to doubt the reality he inhabited. Thomas started to avoid sleep because the nightmares had become torturous. His consciousness became an arena where the Berenson Doll played its terrifying game. He saw it as a living, moving figure, advancing toward him with its distorted smile and eyes that seemed to bore into his soul. Anxiety slowly but inexorably grew, like a hand squeezing his heart. He began to notice his hands trembling, his heart beating faster, and his breathing becoming erratic. He could no longer distinguish between reality and nightmare, and the fear of this unfathomable boundary made him tremble with anxiety. He felt that something was changing within him, as if a part of his soul had been seized by this dreadful doll. He ceased to recognize himself. His thoughts became tangled, and his gaze lost its clarity. He turned to doctors, attempting to find an explanation for his mental state, but even they couldn't provide a suitable explanation for his strange behavior. Conversations with loved ones became difficult. He felt they didn't understand him, couldn't see what he saw. He felt isolated, severed from a world that was becoming increasingly distorted and foreign. Each day, the growing unease felt inevitable, like a whirlpool pulling him into darkness. Thomas tried to rid himself of the doll, to burn it, throw it away, destroy it, but it always returned, like an obsession. Its smile, its eyes, its ominous presence continued to haunt him, as if he had become a victim of his own nightmares. Thomas stood before his house. Its facade seemed distorted and flickering in the darkness. The night was filled with silence, as if even the wind held its breath, sensing something unusual. In his hands, he held the Berenson Doll, which had started to emit a faint light, as if beckoning him inside. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness, like 2 points drawing him into an abyss. Thomas felt his hands reaching forward, as if pulled by a magnet. He tried to resist, but something in this doll, in its twisted smile, in its glowing eyes, as if it knew the hidden fears of his soul. The door to the house was partially open, as if it awaited his arrival. On the threshold, he felt the pulsation of an invisible attraction, as if this house were a magnet for his nightmares. Each of his steps seemed predetermined, as if he moved on inertia, unable to resist this unseen force. The Berenson Doll seemed to call to him, its light acting as a lure. It was a conduit between the world of reality and whatever was concealed in this abandoned house. Thomas tried to understand what was happening, what forces held sway over his mind, but each step brought him closer to the point where darkness began to overwhelm the light. Finally, he entered the house, and darkness swallowed him. Despite the fear that awaited inside, he moved forward as if under the influence of a magnet. He could hear his heart pounding loudly, and he felt the weight of his steps, as if he were walking through a swamp of fear. The Berenson Doll continued to emit light in his hands, as if it were his guide in this nightmarish world. Its light grew brighter, as if it merged with the darkness around him. He tried to close his eyes, to turn away, but the magnetism of this nightmarish entity was too strong. Thomas found himself inside the house, and the walls seemed alive, as if they were breathing. Ancient candles lit the hall, and the Berenson Doll began to emit its own light, as if it were the source of the darkness. Thomas felt the magnetism of this nightmarish entity enveloping him, as he became a prisoner of its power. He understood that something sinister was coming to life inside this house, and he had become a part of something terrifying. The Berenson Doll seemed to beckon him deeper. It was a magnet drawing him toward the mysteries of this abandoned reality. Thomas couldn't resist this call. as if he were destined to encounter what lay inside, the nightmares and horrors that were beginning to unfold before him. Thomas took a step inside the house, and darkness seemed to engulf him. The door closed behind him with a heavy sound, as if it had separated him from the world, leaving him alone in this abandoned place. He turned on the flashlight on his phone, and its light revealed antique furniture covered in dust. An atmosphere of antiquity and loss hung in the air, as if time had stopped here many years ago. The walls were adorned with crooked photo frames, displaying unfamiliar faces. Each spot in the room seemed as if it were waiting for the return of its former occupants, but they had left, leaving only emptiness and silence behind. The Berenson doll in Thomas's hands began to change, its appearance distorted, as if it had come to life, gaining its own will. The doll's eyes, once ominous and twisted, began to glow like bright points. Its smile became deeper and more contorted, as if it knew secrets hidden from the living. Thomas's gaze was drawn to the doll, as if he were hypnotized. He felt that something was changing within him. Suddenly, in the silence of the house, the sound of footsteps echoed. The sounds were muffled, as if ghosts of the past were treading lightly across the floor of this abandoned place. He held his breath, ear strained, trying to catch every nuance of the sound. The footsteps seemed uncertain, as if someone were wandering through the house, trying to remain unnoticed. Thomas thought he heard faint breathing, as if someone were nearby. He tiptoed forward, moving in the direction of the sound. Every step seemed to amplify the sounds, and he began to discern that the footsteps were not coming from a human. They were strange, distorted sounds, as if the steps of an inanimate, invisible being. Thomas felt fear creeping over him, as he began to realize that he was now alone in this house. He halted, straining his hearing, attempting to understand these nightmarish footsteps. They were quiet, but every rustle, every creak, sent shivers down his spine. He tried to determine the direction from which these sounds were emanating, but they seemed to shift, as if an unseen entity were toying with him, setting its traps. Whispers filled his ears, as if the souls of those who had vanished in this house were trying to warn him. Thomas clutched the Berenson doll tightly, as if it were the sole source of protection in this nightmarish world. Its eyes gleamed, as if it were a witness to this sinister arrival. He tried to concentrate, to understand what was happening, but his mind began to drift, as if there were no longer any boundaries between reality and nightmare. The next moments were filled with anticipation and fear, as if the nightmares had begun to break free from their grim hiding places and were closing in on him. Thomas stood in the darkness, the Berenson doll glowing in his hands, knowing that something sinister, invisible, and dangerous was approaching him. Thomas continued to stand in the darkness, as if every breath he took could disrupt the fragile balance of this nightmarish place. He felt the walls of the house darken with their past, as if each year spent in oblivion added to their weight. Images began to form in his imagination, as if the ghosts of long-forgotten inhabitants of this house were coming to life. He saw shadows whispering their stories to him. In the dim light of the flashlight, it seemed as though the walls were beginning to move, as if they wanted to crush him. He felt that these drawings held the key to the mysteries of this place, as if they were a guide. Thomas stood before one of the drawings, his flashlight revealing an image of the doll, its smile distorted. It seemed to leap from the wall, as if coming to life. The Berenson doll seemed to respond to these drawings. Its light grew brighter, as if it were urging him to explore further. He took a step closer to the drawing, and almost felt like he was touching its surface. The drawing appeared so realistic that he could almost feel its texture under his fingertips. Thomas understood that each drawing contained a sinister story, as if they were records of the nightmares that had occurred in this house. He felt that the magic of the walls was beginning to cloud his mind, as if he had become a part of this dark symphony of fear. The doll glowed brightly in his hands, as if it were merging with the dark aura of the altar. Its eyes sparkled as if ancient secrets were on the verge of being revealed. Around him, it seemed as if the darkness was closing in, as if evil were gathering around him. The air felt thick, as if it were saturated with the smell of horror and fear. Thomas thought he heard a faint scratching sound, as if something were clawing its way out from the depths of this place, trying to escape. Suddenly, the sound grew louder, and the air seemed to tremble. Something was moving in the darkness. Thomas recoiled, his heart beating faster, as if it were warning of impending danger. The doll in his hands reacted to this presence, its light flickering brighter. From the depths of the darkness, the outlines of a monster began to take shape. At first, they were just dark silhouettes, like nightmares, but then they gained form and structure. Thomas's eyes widened in horror as he realized that a creature he couldn't even imagine was awakening before him. The monster emerged from the darkness, its body contorted, as if broken bones and skin melded into a grotesque form. Its enormous fingers, like claws, reached out towards him, as if it intended to grab him. The creature's eyes were bottomless and filled with hunger, as if it had been starving after a long slumber. The creature extended its long, twisted fingers, as if it were reaching for him. Thomas felt his own legs grow heavy, as if his mind were being influenced by these sinister forces. His heart pounded, as if it were trying to break free from his chest, to escape this nightmarish threat. The creature drew closer to Thomas, its silhouette seemingly absorbing the light, enveloping him in darkness and despair. Thomas felt the magic of this nightmarish reality beginning to seep into him, changing him, as if he were becoming a part of this terrible symphony of fear and evil. The creature drew closer, its contours becoming clearer, as if it was born from darkness and fear. Thomas felt his legs trembling, his hands shaking, as if he were hypnotized by this ominous threat. He couldn't look away, as if the monster was penetrating his mind, turning him into its captive. The light from the Berenson Doll seemed to battle the darkness, like the last barrier between these two worlds. It shone brightly, as if it were a symbol of resistance, a symbol of hope. Thomas looked at it as if it were the only anchor in this nightmarish reality. And then, something began to change. The doll's smile, once distorted and menacing, started to transform. Its lips moved, as if it was gaining its own will. The smile widened, became more expressive, but at the same time, it changed, as if it became more maniacal. The doll's eyes, previously glowing with bright light, turned dark, as if they began to reflect the darkness of the monster before Thomas. Its gaze was distorted, as if something sinister and ancient had awakened within it. Thomas felt a cold sweat trickling down his spine, as fear started to grip him even tighter. In that moment, he realized that the doll and the monster were one and the same. They were connected, as if the doll embodied his terrors and nightmares. The monster could assume different forms. It could hide its true nature behind a mask of innocence. Thomas understood that he was entangled in the web of his own fears, that he had become a pawn in this nightmarish game. His mind was a prisoner of the magic of this place, his consciousness torn between reality and nightmare. He knew that to break free, he needed to confront this evil face to face. The monster continued to draw nearer, its grotesque figure becoming more distinct. Thomas tore his gaze away from the doll, and his eyes met the creature's. In its dark eyes, there was something ancient, something malevolent and hungry. He felt his mind descending into this chaos, becoming a part of the nightmare unfolding before him. The Berenson Doll, which had seemed like his last hope, was now an instrument of this evil. Its maniacal smile was deceptive, as if it were a guiding thread in this dark labyrinth. Thomas realized that he stood on the brink between consciousness and madness, between reality and nightmare. Thomas clenched the doll in his hands as if his decision to leave it behind was the key to salvation. He looked back at the house that had held him captive, as if its walls harbored something incredibly sinister. He noticed the nearest window and made a sudden move that would have seemed impossible before. Gritting his teeth, he hurled the doll through the window. The sound of shattering glass was like a scream that pierced the darkness of the night. The doll disappeared into the nocturnal abyss, and he waited, hoping that this nightmarish reality would vanish with it. He felt empty, as if a part of him had departed with the doll. However, instead of finding release, he felt invisible hands gripping his mind, as if the malevolence wouldn't allow him to break free. He felt his body being pulled backward, as if his attempt to escape this nightmare was doomed from the start. His heart pounded harder, and he didn't hesitate for a second. With a curse on his lips, he lunged forward, as if trying to sever this invisible tether. He didn't look back. His eyes were fixed forward, toward the door through which he hoped to escape. The surrounding rooms began to blur in his mind, as if he was trapped in a bewildering labyrinth with no way out. He threw himself across thresholds, through doors, as if trying to shed this nightmarish guise. But wherever he went, the Berenson Doll returned to him, as if it were a curse that pursued him. He saw it in every room, at every turn. Its distorted face, maniacal smile, and black eyes became part of every wall, every surface. He couldn't escape its gaze, as if it had always been there, always lurking in the shadows. Thomas felt like he was losing his sanity, like he had become a pawn in this nightmarish game, as if his mind and soul were prisoners of this house. He understood that he couldn't run from himself, that this doll was his own fears that he carried with him. With each step, each moment, he became increasingly convinced that there was no escaping this nightmare. The Berenson Doll had become his shadow, his reflection, his nightmare. Thomas enters the door, crossing the threshold as if he hopes to leave the nightmare behind. He finds himself in a room where the walls and ceiling are covered in mirrors. Each mirror creates endless reflections, as if the room expands to infinity. The light from one of the candles behind him reflects in the mirrors, creating numerous flickering points of light. In this symphony of mirrors, he sees himself standing in different poses and angles, as if he's in parallel worlds. The reflections appear distorted, as if they could come to life at any moment. Every step, every movement generates new reflections, and he begins to feel reality blurring. His heart beats faster when he notices that even the mirror in front of him reflects the Berenson Doll on the floor. Its black eyes gleam in the reflection, as if it's mocking his unease. He decides to focus on his own reflection, trying to convince himself that it's real, that he is real. But as he approaches the mirror, his reflection starts to distort. His face begins to contort, as if the mask is smoothing into an expressionless shadow. He steps back, but the reflection continues to change, as if his essence is trying to slip away. He starts to feel his reality dissolving, as if he's losing himself. His heart pounds harder, and he rushes toward the exit through which he came. He sees his reflection in the last mirror, but it no longer resembles him. His face is twisted with horror. Thomas bursts out of the room as if fleeing from the ghosts of his own fears. Everything he saw in that room continues to flicker before his eyes, as if it's now a part of his own mind. Thomas ran, his lungs burning, and his heart pounding like a wild beast. After the agonizing journey through the mirrored room, he finally found the door leading out of this nightmarish labyrinth. With a sense of panic, he yanked it open and burst outside. The light of the night street blinded him. He tilted his head back, squinting, trying to catch his breath. A gentle breeze brushed against him, as if tarrying relief. Thomas felt like he had escaped, that this was the end of his nightmare. He surveyed his surroundings. The world around him seemed unreal. The streets, the houses, the streetlights. He sensed he had returned to his world, that he was safe again. His home loomed ahead, and he took a few steps in that direction. But something was amiss. Thomas noticed that the shadow of his legs stretched unusually long on the asphalt. He turned around and saw that the shadow he cast on the ground didn't resemble his own. It was the shadow of the Berenson Doll, with its maniacal smile and black eyes. Fear gripped Thomas once again. He recoiled, his heart pounding faster. The Berenson Doll was where it shouldn't be. It was part of this world, part of reality. He couldn't understand how it could have ended up here, how it could be following him. The doll began to move slowly, as if coming to life, as if it were his master. Thomas retreated, his legs heavy as if his muscles had no strength left. He realized he hadn't escaped the trap, that this place was the lair of the nightmare, and there was no way out. The doll approached, and he felt he couldn't run or resist anymore. Its black eyes gleamed as if they saw into his very soul. Fear and despair mingled in his eyes as he looked at his inexorable tormentor. In the next moment, he felt something cold and sharp pierce his chest. He screamed, his cry echoing in the night, but no one heard. The Berenson Doll was next to him, its smile widening, its eyes growing even darker. Thomas's vision began to blur. He felt his strength leaving his body. He fell to the ground, his hands losing their grip, his gaze becoming unfocused. The Berenson Doll stood over him as if it were the ruler of this nightmare, and for the last time, he saw its maniacal smile before his consciousness faded. The last thing he heard was the sound of its laughter, which became his final curse. No one ever saw Thomas again.